I gave my son everything I had, and on his wedding day, he seated me in the storage room while his new mother-in-law sat at the family table. This is a story about what happens when your only child decides that someone else's parent matters more than you do. My name is Helen, and I raised my son David by myself after his father left us when David was 7. I worked as a secretary during the day and cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. We lived in a small apartment, but I made sure David never felt poor. I saved every extra dollar for his future and went without new clothes or vacations. David was accepted into college, and I was so proud I cried for an entire evening. I emptied my savings to cover what his scholarships did not pay for. He graduated and got a good job, and I thought all my sacrifices had been worth it. Then he met Rebecca, and everything began to change. She came from money, and her parents owned a large home in the best part of town. David started spending all his time with her family, and I saw him less and less. When he proposed, I was happy for him, but I noticed he seemed distant. The wedding planning started, and Rebecca's mother, Sandra, took over everything. I offered to help with costs, but David said Rebecca's parents were handling it all. I felt a little hurt, but I told myself it was their wedding and their choice. The invitation arrived, and it was beautiful with gold lettering on cream cardstock. I hung it on my refrigerator and counted down the days. A week before the wedding, David called and asked if we could meet for coffee. He seemed nervous and avoided looking directly at me. He said that seating at the wedding was complicated because the venue had limited space. I told him I understood and that I would be happy wherever he placed me. He paused for a long time before saying that I would be seated in a separate area. I asked him what he meant by separate. He said that her family had a lot of important guests and the main hall was reserved for them. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice steady. I asked where exactly I would be sitting. He said there was a small room near the kitchen where a few other guests would be seated. I asked if he was serious, and he would not meet my eyes. He said it was just for the ceremony and that I could join everyone for the reception. I sat there looking at my son and barely recognized him. I asked him if he realized what he was asking me to accept. He said it was not personal and that he hoped I would understand. I told him I would think about it and left before I started crying in front of him. I went home and sat in my apartment staring at that invitation on the refrigerator. I thought about all the nights I worked while he slept. I thought about every birthday and Christmas where I gave him everything and kept nothing for myself. I decided I would go to the wedding because I needed to see this with my own eyes. The day arrived and I drove to the venue in the only nice dress I owned. It was a beautiful location with gardens and a fountain in the courtyard. I walked inside and a young woman with a clipboard asked my name. She checked her list and then led me down a hallway away from the main entrance. We passed the kitchen where staff were preparing food. She opened a door to a small room with a tiny window and 4 folding chairs. There was a closed-circuit television on a stand showing a feed of the ceremony space. I was told I could watch from here, and that someone would come get me when it was time for the reception. I sat down in that room and felt something inside me go completely cold. Through the screen, I watched guests arrive in elegant clothes and take their seats. I saw Rebecca's mother, Sandra, sitting in the front row wearing a lavender dress and a proud smile. I saw David standing at the altar looking nervous and happy. The ceremony began, and I watched my son get married on a television screen in a storage room. When it ended, I waited for someone to come and get me like they promised. 30 minutes passed and no one came. I finally opened the door and walked back toward the main hall. The reception had started and I could hear music and laughter. I stood in the doorway and saw David and Rebecca dancing while guests cheered. Sandra was at a table near the front talking with other well-dressed people. I looked for my name card and found it at a table in the very back corner near the service entrance. I sat down alone and no one came to speak to me. David did not look my way even once during the entire evening. I stayed for an hour, and then I left without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home and sat in my car outside my apartment building for a long time. I knew in that moment that something between us had broken beyond repair. I did not cry because I was too angry to cry. The next week, I went through all my old paperwork and found something I had forgotten about. Years ago, my mother had passed away and left me a small inheritance that I never touched. I had put it in a savings account, intending to give it to David someday. The account had grown to nearly $60,000. I had always planned to surprise him with it when he needed it most. But sitting there looking at those statements, I realized he did not deserve it. I withdrew the money and used it to pay off my apartment and buy a reliable car. I booked a trip to Europe that I had dreamed about my entire life. I did not tell David about any of it. He called me a few days after the wedding and asked if I had enjoyed myself. I told him the truth and said I had spent his wedding in a storage room watching on a screen. He was quiet for a moment and then said he thought I had understood the situation. I told him I understood perfectly and that I would not forget it. He tried to apologize, but his words sounded empty. I told him I needed time and ended the call. Months went by and he reached out occasionally, but I kept my responses brief. I went on my trip and saw Paris and Rome and Vienna. I ate at cafes and visited museums and felt free for the first time in decades. When I returned, I started taking classes and made new friends who treated me with respect. David eventually stopped calling as often. I heard from a neighbor that he and Rebecca had bought a house near her parents. I felt nothing when I heard this because he had already become a stranger. One day I received a letter from him in the mail. He wrote that he realized he had treated me poorly and that he was sorry. He said Sandra had been pushing him to prioritize Rebecca's family, and he had gone along with it. He wrote that he missed me and wanted to make things right. I read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer. I did not respond right away because I wanted to be sure of my feelings. A month later, I wrote back and told him that I appreciated his apology, but that things had changed. I explained that I had built a life that did not revolve around waiting for his attention. I said that if he wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one where I was treated with dignity. I told him about the inheritance I had kept and how I spent it on myself instead of him. I wanted him to know that I was no longer the mother who gave everything without expecting anything in return. He called me after receiving my letter and his voice was shaken. He said he understood and that he would respect my boundaries. We began talking again slowly and carefully. He visited my apartment and seemed surprised by how different it looked. I had redecorated and filled it with things that made me happy. He apologized again, and this time it felt more sincere. I did not forgive him completely because some wounds do not heal quickly, but I allowed him back into my life in small ways. We meet for coffee sometimes and talk about safe topics. He knows now that I am not someone who can be taken for granted. I will never sit in a storage room again for anyone. I have my independence and my self-respect, and I will not give those up. David is learning that love is not the same as obligation, and I am learning that it is never too late to choose yourself. He told me that Sandra had stopped speaking to him after he refused to invest in her brother's business. He said Rebecca was angry, but that he felt more like himself than he had since the engagement. I watched my son slowly remember who he was before he tried to become someone else. He started visiting me more often and asking about my life instead of just talking about his own. He noticed the paintings I had hung on my walls from my trip to Europe. He asked me about the places I had been and seemed genuinely interested in my stories. One evening, he brought dinner to my apartment and we ate together like we used to years ago. He told me he was proud of me for building a life that made me happy. He said he was sorry it took him so long to see how strong I had always been. I told him that strength is often invisible until it is tested. He nodded and I could see tears in his eyes. I reached across the table and held his hand the way I used to when he was a boy. I told him that I never stopped loving him even when I was angry. He said he knew, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving he deserved that love. I did not need him to prove anything, but I appreciated the sentiment. We finished our dinner and talked late into the night about everything and nothing. When he left, I stood at my window and watched him walk to his car. He turned back and waved, and I waved back. I realized that some relationships can survive even the deepest wounds if both people are willing to heal. I do not know what will happen with David and Rebecca, but I know that my son has finally learned what it means to respect the people who truly love him. And I have learned that my worth was never dependent on his recognition. I am enough all by myself. I have my home and my memories and my hard-won peace. And if David continues to show up with honesty and respect, then he will have a place in my life. But I will never again make myself small so that someone else can feel big. I will never again sit in the back room and pretend it does not hurt. I spent too many years being invisible. Now I take up space and I do not apologize for it. That is the gift I gave myself when I finally chose my own dignity over his comfort. David is learning that love is not the same as obligation, and I am learning that it is never too late to choose yourself. A year after the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call from Sandra. Her voice was cold, and she asked if we could meet to discuss something important. I agreed mostly out of curiosity about what she could possibly want from me. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. She arrived wearing expensive jewelry and carrying a designer handbag. She sat down across from me and did not bother with small talk. She said that David had been distant lately and that Rebecca was concerned. She said she knew that I had been filling his head with guilt about the wedding. I almost laughed at the audacity of her accusation. I told her calmly that I had simply told David the truth about where I sat that day. She waved her hand dismissively and said I was being dramatic. She said that weddings are complicated, and that I should have been grateful to be included at all. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I told her that I had raised David alone while she had simply written checks for Rebecca. She looked at me with contempt and said that money was a form of love too. I told her that money without respect was just payment for services rendered. She stood up and said I was bitter and jealous of what her family could provide. I stood up too and looked her directly in the eyes. I told her that I pitied her because she believed everything could be bought. I said that one day Rebecca might learn the difference between a mother who sacrifices and one who simply spends. Sandra left without another word, and I sat back down to finish my coffee. I felt lighter somehow, as if speaking my truth had released something heavy. 2 months later, David called and said he needed to talk to me urgently. He came to my apartment looking tired and worn down. He told me that his marriage was struggling and that Rebecca had become controlling. He said she consulted her mother about every decision, and he felt like an outsider in his own home. I listened without interrupting because I wanted him to hear himself speak. He said he was starting to understand how I must have felt at the wedding. He said Rebecca had recently excluded him from a family event because her parents were upset with him. I asked him how it felt to be treated as if he did not matter. He looked down at his hands and said it felt horrible. I told him that I forgave him, but that forgiveness did not erase what happened. I said that he needed to decide what kind of life he wanted to live. He asked me if I thought he should leave Rebecca. I told him that only he could make that choice, but that he deserved to be valued. He left my apartment looking confused, but also more awake than he had been in years. Over the next few months, David started setting boundaries with Rebecca and her family.